Hello there guys, and welcome to part 2 of my Avro York build. If you saw part 1, you might remember that I opened this Mach 2 1/72 scale Avro York kit and was quite surprised at some of the content given that it is from 2016. I think it's fair to say it wasn't the highest quality kit in the world, but nevertheless I did have some fun in the first part and I've continued to enjoy the build process since then. It has certainly been one of those kits that tests and helps you improve your skills, particularly in terms of filling and sanding. These were the instructions that the kit gives us, so fairly basic. And this is how I left things in the last video, with lots of parts spread out on my mat, ready for sanding, cleanup and sub-assembly construction. I should also point out at this stage that I'm building this as part of the Tiny Flying Legends project, which aims to create a scale model of Duxford Airshow from 2005. And you can find more information about the project on Facebook, and I'll put a link in the description below for that. It's quite funny because I feel like I've worked many hours on this kit, and I thought I'd have lots and lots of video to show you, and this would be quite a long video. But actually I don't have that much video at all, and I'm guessing that's probably because most of the work I've been doing has been filling and sanding and priming, and then repeating that process quite a few times. But let's have a look at what I have done. The first area for my attention was the wings. The fit itself wasn't too bad. The parts have gone together okay, but there are clearly gaps there in the top of the engines, and of course there are lots of edges there that need to be sanded. The first thing I did was get stuck in with the filling, and for this I initially used the Vallejo plastic putty, which is a water-based filler. I like this for its ease of use. It does have a few drawbacks, one of which is that it tends to shrink quite a bit when it dries, so you can pile it on here and then find it's gone right back into those gaps again later. And the other drawback is that if you put it on too thick, or if you put it on very large areas, when you come to sand it, it often peels up the whole sort of area of filler rather than just sanding the way that the bit you've got. It's quite soft, I think, in that regard. But nevertheless, I did use that as my initial filler. And this is a technique that I quite like to use. Put a bit of filler on the seam and then run either a paper towel, or in this case a cotton bud, along that seam there to try and get it all the way in. And basically many of the joints here on this York needed filler all the way around them. While that was drying, I moved on to the cockpit. I painted the seats up in XF71, which is interior green, and then gave them some Vallejo khaki cushions. And I think I showed this in the previous video where I'd painted the inside of the fuselage interior green, and I'd put those strips at the top and the bottom to enable a better mating of those two surfaces, of those two sides. Now, generally speaking, the fuselage itself went together okay, but there's one quite glaring issue that I had to deal with, and that's right at the front here. You can see the nose barely goes together. You can see there just how much of a gap there really is. And even if I could get that glued together, the amount of force on there pulling it apart, you could pretty much guarantee that it would crack at some point in the model's lifetime. So I took a couple of approaches. The first one is I did shave a little bit off the floor of the cockpit at the sides to try and bring those two fuselage halves closer together. And then I also got a bit of styrene sheet, just an offcut from somewhere. This is why I always keep offcuts. And I just inserted it there into that gap. And that looks really clunky at the moment, but you can just cut it close to the fuselage with a knife and then sand the rest away. Here's the fuselage put together. As you can see, not an actually terrible seam, although one issue we have on the bottom, I'm not really sure what you call this, but basically the two halves of the fuselage sort of curve inwards at the seam. If you're looking at it from the front, it makes kind of like a W shape. I'm sure there must be a word for that. So again, it was out with the Vallejo plastic putty. At this stage, and with gaps this big, I didn't really worry about just trying to make it go only in the gap. I sort of spread it quite widely around the gap, all the way down the spine of the aircraft. And then really it was just a case of sanding it gradually. I think I started with 240 or maybe 400 grit sandpaper. Then I moved on to 600 and 800 grit sandpaper. And then after a few cycles of this, the filling, the sanding and the priming, before applying some primer. And because I knew I'd be doing lots more sanding and filling and priming, I didn't use up my nice Tamiya primer here. Instead I used my Halford's cheapo car primer. It's a bit thicker, a bit coarser, but it really doesn't matter at this stage. I also gave up a little bit on the Vallejo plastic putty, and for the bigger jobs just use some good old regular putty. I forget what it's called now, what brand it is, but it smells a lot more and I'm sure it's a lot nastier. This is what the fuselage looked like after about 3 or 4 rounds of priming and sanding. It's actually surprisingly smooth. And here is a unprimed, unsanded wing compared to the other wing which has been filled, sanded and primed. Quite a big difference actually, isn't it? It's quite indicative. There's a few imperfections still there on the engine nacelles, but I think overall it looks so much better. And this definitely gave me some motivation to work on the rest of it. Of course, once the individual components, the wings and the fuselage, were more or less okay, they had to be mated together. The fit for these wasn't perfect, and I did have to trim the tabs a little bit to get the wings in the right position. But you can see it's starting to take shape. Clearly those wing roots do need some filling as well, but it is slowly moving forwards. The characteristic tail sections were put together and allowed to dry at a right angle before they were added to the fuselage. And then of course we've got the centre fin as well. It's kind of funny, isn't it, how the centre fin started on the Manchester, was removed from the Lancaster, and then was used again later for the York. And again, the slot for that was not the right size or shape, so it needed some cutting and some filling. So the colour scheme I'm going for is the Dan Air scheme, which is the colour scheme that the York used in 2005 at the Duxford Air Show, and the one that actually is still displayed in today in Duxford. Mach 2 do produce a separate boxing with Dan Air decals, but I don't think we could find that when we bought this kit, so that's what I'm going to work towards with this kit. As you can see, we've got a light grey lower fuselage with a white top and a red stripe down the side, and that red stripe is actually surrounded by a black pinstripe top and bottom, which will be interesting. The wings themselves are the same colour grey as the lower fuselage, but they have black strips on the leading edge, and the engine nacelles are painted in a sort of almost like a dark sea grey, almost moving towards like a PRU blue kind of colour, and that colour extends over the back, over the top of the wings, sort of behind the engines. So plenty to think about there. So there was definitely lots to think about there in terms of how I would produce that scheme. I did have the option of producing decals for the stripes, but I figured it would be sensible to mask and paint as much as I could. So what I did is paint the light grey first using Tamiya XF19 with a little bit of black added. I think this might have been a bit too dark actually. Then I used Tamiya masking tape straight down the middle of the fuselage and painted the white on top. And the idea here was that the demarcation line there between the white and the grey would be the centre, roughly, of the red stripe. That was a little bit of a schoolboy error, and I'll come back to that shortly. Now I was more concerned with getting the width of the stripe consistent rather than having it millimetre perfectly accurate to the real aircraft. So I took some of my 6mm Tamiya tape and I laid that down on the aircraft exactly where I wanted the stripe to be. I then took some more masking tape and I masked directly above and below that 6mm stripe, trying to get the masking tape as close as possible to it, but without overlapping it. Once I was happy with that masking, I removed the 6mm middle strip, and that left me with a gap where the red stripe and the black pinstripe should go. In a way this was a bit convoluted. Maybe I should have just painted a wide red stripe initially and then masked that to cover it and painted the white and the grey below it. But I was worried that the white wouldn't adequately cover the red. As it happened, this wasn't perfect. I had to put a lot of red paint down because of course I've got a mix of white and grey as the base for the red stripe, and unless I put lots of red paint down, there was a slight tonal difference because of that different base colour. Nevertheless, I think on removing the masking tape, the result was pretty decent. There is of course still a lot of masking to do. The black pinstripe is completely missing at the moment. There's no black on the tail fins, and there's none of that blue-grey colour on the engine nacelles. But I think so far this is turning out fairly well. There's some touch-ups to do, but I think I'm going to leave that as it is for now and come back to the final steps in a future video. So I'd like to say thank you to all of you for watching, and a special thanks to my Patreon supporters and YouTube members. I hope you've enjoyed watching this video. Thank you to all of you for your support, and until next time, have fun modelling.